Secret evil rituals, pentagrams, sacrifices, blood, and demons. These are some of the things that we find associated with Satanism in pop culture. We find it in episodes of The X-Files, in movies like Paranormal Activity or in Rosemary's Baby, and of course in the imagery of metal music. But what is Satanism really? Is there such a thing in reality? And if so, does it look anything like what we see in the movies? What is the history of Satanism and the devil, and what can that teach us about religion, secularism, and other movements in the modern and contemporary world? These are some of the questions that we will explore as we dive into the occult world of Satanism. In the 1980s and 90s, there were many accounts and controversies surrounding supposed satanic rituals in the woods, and a great concern among many people about these satanic themes in some popular and underground music. This phenomenon became known as the Satanic Panic, where fear surrounding this topic was at an all-time high, a phenomenon that still affects culture to a major degree today. There were many claims of satanic rituals being performed in the woods, of people being murdered by satanic cults, and music included subliminal messages leading to these kinds of actions. This was the claim, at least. As a result, a lot of people were actually put on trial or accused of things that in the end turned out to be entirely unsubstantiated, which still had major negative effects on their lives and those around them. But this was nothing new. Any reading of Christian history will reveal that anxieties and claims of Satanism have popped up from time to time, almost always as a way for the church to label heretics, and almost always being completely unsupported and false. So claims of people being Satanists, always determined by those outside the group in question, have existed for a large part of history. The whole history of Satan as the epitome of evil, a spiritual being that opposes God, terrorizes human beings with his demons, and lures them into sin, is one that develops primarily in early Christianity. The word Satan is Semitic or Hebrew in origin, and we can find it in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. It means something like opposer, adversary, or accuser, and it shows up perhaps most prominently in the book of Job, where a Satan is the one that doubts Job's true devotion and tells God to send him trouble as a test. Now, there is no reason to think that Satan is used here as a name for this character, however, but functions primarily as a more literal designation of an adversary to God. In fact, putting aside later Christian interpolations and readings into the Hebrew Bible, there is really no reference at all to any devil or Satan as we know him today in all or any of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. But by the time of Jesus and the New Testament, things had started to change. The movement known as Apocalypticism had had a major impact on the theology and worldview of the Jews, where, for example, there was a much more distinct idea of the perpetual conflict between good and evil, along with teachings about a coming day of judgment. Many have argued that these developments were in part due to influence from the major religion of Zoroastrianism. Regardless, once we get to the New Testament and the Gospels, we find a much more concrete idea of Satan as a kind of personification of evil in the world. He tempts Jesus in the desert in the Gospels, and in the book of Revelation is the leader of the rebellious angels. In the Septuagint, the major Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible that most people would have used at this point, the word used to translate ha-Satan, the Hebrew word, into Greek was diabolos, from which we also eventually get the English devil. As the early Christians formulated and expanded the doctrines of their religion, the character of Satan was expanded upon. He was projected backwards onto the Old Testament. For example, the serpent in the Garden of Eden in the book of Genesis was now interpreted to be Satan that had tempted Adam and Eve and led to original sin, according to the Church Father Augustine, for example. Eventually, the devil thus took on the form that we know him as today, and serves as an important, albeit not always prominent, part of Christian theology. Through these developments, the character of Satan also became prominent in Islam. Here the term Satan becomes shaitan, which can be used to refer to the devil, but also to demonic evil forces more generally. Instead, the more personal name of Satan in Islam is Iblis, and he is a similarly important figure in this religion. But like we said, while we do find the character of Satan, at least we can see the development of the character of Satan throughout history, we don't find much in terms of people who actually identify as Satanists or who seem to be Satanist. The only times that we find people being called Satanist is when the church is labeling what they see as heretic groups as being Satanist, using this as a sort of name for the heretics to condemn them. For example, the Cathar movement in southern France in the 12th to 13th centuries was accused of being Satanist. And indeed, Satan did play an important role in their theology. Probably strongly influenced by the dualism of the ancient Gnostics, the Cathars taught that the physical world was actually a prison created by the devil, which needed to be escaped to reach the real God. The world is a battlefield between the forces of good and evil. But clearly, the Cathars did the opposite of worshipping the devil, as he represents the very thing that they aim to turn away from. So to call them Satanists doesn't really work, right? Nonetheless, that's what they were called by some in the Catholic Church. The idea of Satan and his influence on people and society became even more prominent in the early modern period, which we see clearly in the phenomena known as the witch hunts, which lasted from the 15th to basically the 18th century, where an unspeakable amount of women were tried and executed, suspected of being witches and thereby being in cahoots with the devil. In the Malleus Maleficarum, a central text for the justification and spread of the witch trials, new kinds of diabology and demonology were presented. It bears mentioning that the arguments and worldview presented in the Malleus Maleficarum was usually pretty heterodox and ran counter to the official teachings of the Church, but it still proved quite influential in some circles. Here, the devil becomes more emphasized as a worker of material, physical evil, rather than being an interior inspirer of sin and evil behavior in human beings, which was the way that the devil was conceived before, right? He's the whisperer that leads to humans doing bad things. In the early modern period, through the influence of things like the Malleus Maleficarum, the devil was able to physically create evil in the world in different ways. Witches, according to this text, have made a pact with the devil and worked together with him to do evil in the world. It was even conceived that the witches had, let's call it, naughty relationships with Satan. In the text it says, "The witch has offered herself completely and has bound herself to the devil really and in truth, and not fantastically and in the imagination only. And thus it ought to be understood that she cooperates with the devil in body and in truth, for all works of witches are to this end, whether they always carry out their witchcraft through the pact, or through a glance, or through the spoken word, or through the operation of some instrument of witchcraft deposited under the threshold of a house." In Islam, while this kind of approach hasn't been as common, we do see similar examples. For instance, the Yazidis have been accused of being devil worshippers by some Muslims due to the prominence of the angel called Melek Taus in their religion, which is connected, at least by Muslims, to the devil due to having a similar backstory to Iblis in the Quran. So in short, the category of Satanists and Satanism has, throughout most of history, served simply as a weapon by those wishing to accuse others of being heretics, wishing to condemn others. It is used, it is weaponized, it's a weaponized term in the sense. You call the other Satanist. And we don't find any examples in history of people actually self-identifying as Satanists or that somehow worship the devil, right? There's really no evidence for this. Instead, if we're looking for people who actually do self-identify as Satanist, or at least reinterpret the figure of Satan in a more positive light, as a prominent aspect of their worldview, this doesn't really appear until the 19th century. So in some ways, we might be able to say that Satanism, in that sense, is actually born in the modern period, specifically in the 19th century. In order to find out more about this topic, I spoke with Dr. Per Faxneld, an associate professor at Södertörn University in Stockholm, who is an expert on all things occult and esoteric, including Satanism.
I would say we probably have to go back a century or so to the Romantic period, where you have Romantic poets like Byron and Shelley, who were both politically radical, and they were using the devil as a positive symbol of rebellion against authority. Specifically, of course, religious authority, but also absolute monarchy. And in a metaphorical sense, for them, God was the ultimate monarch, in a way. And this, in turn, is something that they picked up from John Milton from his epic Paradise Lost, where Milton probably didn't quite intend for people to read it the way Romantics did. But in their understanding of Milton's Satan, Satan became the ultimate rebel, a symbol of just rebellion.
And this kind of attitude can only really appear in a post-Enlightenment, increasingly secularizing society. Per Faxneld and Johan Nilsson wrote, "Naturally, Satanism as an open identity only became possible in a time when Christianity's hold on legal systems and social norms had weakened. In that sense, Satanism is a direct product of secularization, understood primarily as the severing of ties between state/public sphere and religion. It can, on the other hand, also be said to exist in the field of tension between secularity and religiosity, as some forms of it that were geared toward combating Christian influence would be irrelevant in a hypothetical, completely secular society." In some ways, he is the antithesis of the Church, the actual opposer of religious dogma. In a time when many were moving away from the strict moralism of Christianity, Satan was the perfect counterpoint to that, a symbol of hedonism and individualism, without any of these thinkers actually worshipping Satan or even believing that he is a real entity. The famous Freemason Albert Pike wrote that, quote, "Satan is not a black god, but the negation of God. The devil is the personification of atheism or idolatry. For the initiates, this is not a person, but a force created for good, but which may serve for evil. It is the instrument of liberty or free will." But around the same time, the figure of Satan also becomes very popular in the emerging movements of occultism and Western esotericism, movements that were increasing in popularity by the second half of the 19th century. Most famously, perhaps, is the Theosophical Society, a movement that sought to find the common perennial esoteric core of all the world's religious and philosophical traditions. The movement's primary founder, Helena Blavatsky, wrote in her works like Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine about Satan, giving entirely new esoteric interpretations of some of the prominent biblical stories. Probably inspired by the ancient Gnostics, Blavatsky interprets the story about the fall in the book of Genesis as a positive one. The serpent, or Satan, by having Eve and Adam eat from the tree of knowledge, actually gives them access to gnosis, true knowledge, and is an important starting point for our initiation into esoteric wisdom. In the dualistic system of the ancient Gnostics, which we covered very briefly before, this interpretation does make sense, since the creator of the physical world and the God described in the Hebrew Bible is the evil, ignorant Yaldabaoth, who has imprisoned us in this world. The serpent here becomes a messenger from the true God, who helps Adam and Eve retain a certain spark of the spiritual, true, divine world. Right? So it turns the story of Genesis completely on its head. Blavatsky's interpretation seems slightly different, but retains the essential message of Satan as a positive, heroic figure that helps humankind. Even so, her understanding of Satan is not an actual external being that exists, but as a kind of allegorical symbol for different aspects of our inner life. She says, "Satan, or the red fiery dragon, the lord of phosphorus and Lucifer, or light bearer, is in us. It is our mind, our tempter and redeemer, our intelligent liberator and savior from pure animalism." Now, there had been some unique interpretations of Satan in the Islamic world too throughout history, and especially among the Sufis. In Islam, the origin story of Satan is that he, along with the angels, when God creates Adam, the first human being, he asks all the people of heaven, the angels, to bow before Adam. And they all do except for Iblis, right? Satan, the devil. He refuses to bow before Adam because he thinks himself better, basically. He becomes arrogant, and because of this, God punishes him and condemns him, sends him down to become Satan as we know him, right? But to certain Sufi writers like Al-Hallaj or Ibn al-Qudat al-Hamadani, there was an interesting twist to this story. They argued that Satan was in fact the most devoted monotheist of all the inhabitants of heaven. He didn't want to prostrate before anyone but God, remaining devoted to God only. He thus becomes almost like a monotheistic hero in these accounts, although they importantly add the detail that he still had a certain arrogance in his devotion, leading him to disobey God, which still resulted in him being cast down. So they're not painting him as an actual good character necessarily, but as I mentioned in my video about Hallaj, they add this interesting sort of spicy flavor to the story, where simultaneously he is also the most devoted monotheist, because he refuses to bow to Adam. But Blavatsky's arguments are obviously quite different from this, and in some ways even more radical. Her interpretations, as well as the general social and political roles that Satan played, also played a major part in early feminism. This is what Dr. Faxneld wrote his PhD dissertation about, and which he has studied extensively.
In this book, what I look at is how these ideas that first appeared in Romanticism and Socialism soon were picked up by feminists. Feminists who identified Christianity as one of the supporting pillars of patriarchy, where God was the father and his male priests were suppressing women in various ways. And of course it makes sense, if you have that take on things, to look at God's adversary, the devil, as a potential ally. But not only did it make sense like that, it was also, of course, a very drastic polemical move. So they wanted to provoke people, they wanted to get people's attention. And in a way it was effective. On the other hand, and that's sort of the sad end of this story, it wasn't really that well suited for political feminism, for feminists who actually wanted to gain broad support, for example, for women attaining the vote. So this satanic polemic had to be scrapped in the end because it was just too provocative.
Now, as part of this wider movement, the early feminists also reinterpreted certain stories of the Bible in similar ways to the occultists at that time. For instance, they basically adopted the same reinterpretation of the story of the serpent in Genesis as a bringer of freedom and liberation.
So one of the reasons why these feminists picked up on that story in particular would have been that it was being employed at this time by anti-feminists. So for example, male doctors would use it to justify not giving pain relief to women when they were giving birth, due to giving birth in pain being a punishment from God for accepting the forbidden fruit from the devil. And historically, this story had been used to explain why women were more prone to be witches, for example. So it had a long history of very destructive patriarchal use. So it was only natural, I guess, that these feminists would choose that story and turn it on its head. There are other reasons as well. For example, that there was an esoteric influence on this feminist movement from Theosophy. And Theosophy had this Gnostic strand where they had picked up the notion from ancient Gnosticism that the serpent was in fact a benevolent bringer of gnosis rather than an evil creature.
These thinkers and writings solidified Satan in a completely new way as a symbol for countercultural movements, both political and religious. And this was something that was pretty much unheard of historically, where Satan in Christianity had basically only been associated with evil, right? He is the representation of the very opposite of good, of God. And all this would pave the way for even more pronounced and self-identified forms of Satanisms to appear in the 20th century. It is with figures like Stanislav Przybyszewski and Ben Kadosh or Carl Wilhelm Hansen that we see the first examples of people who identified as Satanist or as Luciferian, and who placed a positive or revised view of Satan at the very core of their ideas. This was of course inspired by the developments and writings previously mentioned, but took on a more explicit sort of form here. Przybyszewski presents in his De Synagoge des Satan an almost Gnostic-like dualist worldview, where the evil god, or Satan, is the creator of the material world, as well as the symbol and originator of intellectual thought, freedom, and investigation. The good God is the creator of these spiritual, immaterial aspects and is identified with the God of Christianity, who asks his followers to give up their individuality and freedom to become poor in spirit in service of him. Unlike the Gnostic movements like the Cathars, it is the devil who here is the God to actually be followed, rather than the restrictive God followed by Christianity. Ben Kadosh is also a significant figure who self-identified as a Luciferian and seems to have tried to actually create an occult group that focused on the worship of Satan. In his system, Satan or Lucifer had been misunderstood historically and could be identified with certain pre-Christian pagan deities, primarily the god Pan. In his famous work called The Nye Morgens Gry, Dawn of the New Morning, he lays down his interpretations pretty clearly. He says, "Thus, Lucifer in his entirety is a reality and no illusion, and to worship him, the hunted wolf, is proper. This little book, handed over to the judgment of its readers, will do its part in order for him, the persecuted, to regain his lost original standing." In both of these thinkers, Satan also becomes strongly associated with fertility and the pleasures and creativity of materiality. Here we see the emergence of depictions of Satan with phallic symbolism, which is quite common still today. While very influential on later Satanism, none of these thinkers just mentioned actually created a fraternity or group that would survive, at least for long, after their own lifetime. For an example of the first organized Satanic Church, or self-proclaimed Satanist movement as such, we have to move all the way to the 1960s and the very famous activities of Anton LaVeyan, founder of the Church of Satan. LaVeyan is a very interesting character in the 20th century. He grew up in Los Angeles but eventually moved to San Francisco. Throughout his life, he was always interested in the occult, studying old grimoires, magic, and things like hypnotism. He claimed to be a circus lion tamer, a hypnotist, artist, musician, and much else. He also claimed to have worked as a crime scene photographer for the San Francisco Police Department, where he naturally had to witness some truly gruesome scenes of murders, dead bodies, and other horrors that strengthened his convictions as an atheist. To him, no good God could ever allow such terrible things. Eventually, in the late 1960s, amid the many countercultural movements that appeared at that time, he founded the Church of Satan, perhaps the clearest example thus far of an organized, self-identified form of Satanism, with certain principles, rituals, and an inner hierarchy. LaVeyan was a very eccentric and charismatic person in himself, dressing in unusual ways, living in an all-black Victorian home, and his brand of Satanism would become very influential. LaVeyan Satanism is essentially atheistic. They do not believe in the reality of an actual entity called Satan, and they naturally don't worship such an entity then. Instead, just like in many earlier reinterpretations of Satan in the 19th century, the devil is here a kind of symbol, a symbol of rebellion, of humanity and rationality, consciously precisely in opposition to religion and its restrictive and moralistic rules and teachings. There is no God, and religion goes against our natural human nature. It restricts us from living our natural life and taking part in the pleasures and experiences of the body. LaVeyan wrote, quote, "There is no God. There is no supreme, all-powerful deity in the heavens that cares about the lives of human beings. Man is the only God. Man must be taught to answer to himself and other men for his actions." LaVeyan Satanism teaches that we shouldn't look to some higher power for solutions to our problems or to blame for our misfortunes. Instead, we need to take personal responsibility for our lives. In a way, it's a kind of worship of the human being itself in all its bodily features. We should enjoy life and its pleasures without guilt as long as we don't hurt other people. The scholar Simony Holt says, LaVeyan proposes Satanism as a religion that centralizes one's own ego, wherein one's natural desires and emotions are not suppressed, but exalted as a primary goal for Satanists. That is, the ideal Satanist seeks to fulfill personal goals professionally, personally, financially, without shame or apology. Embedded in this is also a kind of social progressivism, because we should not be ashamed of any of our desires and wants, even if those happen to be that we are gay or bi or whatever preferences we may have. In every way, LaVeyan Satanism is thus a kind of anti-religion, although specifically aimed at Christianity perhaps, a critique and rebellion against everything that religion/Christianity stands for, at least according to them. And the mythology and symbolism of Satan and the occult is used as a provocation against that, an important aspect of the aesthetic presentation of the movement without ever claiming that the devil is a real entity. Although it should be pointed out that there have been some within the movement that lean toward a more theistic interpretation, perhaps most prominently Michael Aquino, who left the church in the 70s over these disagreements to instead form a movement known as the Temple of Set, which has a much more theistic leaning in their form of Satanism. In his famous Satanic Bible, LaVeyan outlines the 9 satanic statements, which are the following. 1. Satan represents indulgence instead of abstinence. Satan represents vital existence instead of spiritual pipe dreams. Satan represents undefiled wisdom instead of hypocritical self-deceit. Satan represents kindness to those who deserve it instead of love wasted on ingrates. Satan represents vengeance instead of turning the other cheek. Satan represents responsibility to the responsible instead of concern for psychic vampires. Satan represents man as just another animal who, because of his divine spiritual and intellectual development, has become the most vicious animal of all. Satan represents all the so-called sins, as they all lead to physical, mental, or emotional gratification. Satan has been the best friend the church has ever had, as he has kept it in business all these years. There are also the so-called 11 satanic rules. 1. Do not give opinions or advice unless you are asked. Do not tell your troubles to others unless you are sure they want to hear them. When in another's home, show them respect or else do not go there. If a guest in your home annoys you, treat them cruelly and without mercy. Do not make advances unless you are given the mating signal. Do not take that which does not belong to you unless it is a burden to the other person and they cry out to be relieved. Acknowledge the power of magic if you have employed it successfully to obtain your desires. If you deny the power of magic after having called upon it with success, you will lose all you have obtained. Do not complain about anything to which you need not subject yourself. Do not harm little children. Do not kill non-human animals unless you are attacked or for your food. When walking in open territory, bother no one. If someone bothers you, ask him to stop. If he does not stop, destroy him. As you can tell, many of these points and rules have a kind of comical, humorous tone to them. And this is a prominent aspect of LaVeyan Satanism and a lot of other forms of Satanism too. Because the whole movement is sort of in opposition to Christianity, it uses sometimes humor and sort of hyperbolical expressions in this sort of anti-religion, in a sense. And in this way, the aesthetics, the symbols, the language of Satanism, which is very theatrical, very colorful, and uses all these, sometimes humorous, sometimes not, but these, these aesthetics and these symbols and words, there's a point to all that, and that becomes especially clear in the actual rituals of the Church of Satan.
So Anton LaVeyan's take on ritual is that it's psychodrama. It can affect change in people through, of course, psychological means. So there's nothing necessarily supernatural going on most of the time.
Okay.
So there's an ambiguity there as well, where LaVeyan would sometimes speak of like tapping into a dark force in nature and things like that. And he was fond of making references to having, affected something supernatural at times. But it's a bit difficult to tell how serious he was about these things. For example, he could talk about causing an earthquake by playing his organ, or cutting something from a newspaper and then cutting off someone's head, and then that person died in a car accident where his head was cut off, and that sort of thing. But as a whole, Anton LaVeyan's take on ritual is that it's psychodrama. So it's something that you stage to have the appropriate effect on yourself, and it's very much centered on the self at all times. So sort of the effect that you want is modifying something in your own behavior. So it's very much sort of in tune with the pop psychology of the time, but with this sort of Halloween-y framework around it.
Often when talking about Satanism, people will divide it into two camps: atheistic Satanism and theistic Satanism. Anton LaVeyan and the Church of Satan is an example of the former category of atheistic Satanism, where the devil is an important symbol, but isn't worshipped or even believed in as a real entity. This is by far the overwhelmingly most popular and widespread form of Satanism, and is not exclusive to the Church of Satan, but also many other contemporary Satanistic groups most of them are atheistic. On the other hand, theistic Satanism denotes the opposite. These are people who actually believe in Satan as a real spiritual being toward whom worship or reverence is directed. This is definitely a more marginal category, and furthermore, this wider division is quite generalizing, as I'm sure you can see. We saw the Temple of Set and Michael Aquino as one example of such a theistic Satanism, but another example of a more explicit theistic Satanism can be seen in the early black metal movement, especially in the early 90s and in Scandinavia. Bands like the Norwegian Mayhem and its lead figure Euronymous drew heavily on satanic symbolism and imagery that had been quite common in certain earlier metal scenes, but here they took it even further. It wasn't just an aesthetic element of their image, but seems to have been a very real conviction, where Satan as a force of evil was worshipped, and the music was only a kind of extension of that. It's also true that several crimes and acts of violence were connected with these groups, including the burning of several churches in Norway and even a few murders. Now, we have to be careful when we talk about this, though, because this was the time of the Satanic Panic, where claims of satanic rituals and satanic murders were widespread. People were panicking over these, especially in North America and also in Europe to some degree. And this led to a lot of problems in the other direction, by people who were falsely accused of doing these things, when in most cases there was no substantiating evidence for any of this, right? So we see in the black metal scene, for example, there are some examples of theistic Satanists who even committed acts of violence like burning churches. But with that said, we always have to be careful not to fall into the trap of sort of putting fuel to the fire of the Satanic Panic, which in itself was, of course, very destructive. We must remember that even though there are cases like certain pockets of the black metal movement in the early 90s, this does not represent the vast majority of even self-proclaimed Satanists, even theistic Satanists. Indeed, even within the category of theistic Satanism, these cases are quite unique and very uncommon in the sense that they explicitly worship Satan as a representation of evil, thus in a way affirming the Christian interpretation of the devil, only directing worship to him instead of God. These black metal figures thus formulated their brand of Satanism not only in opposition to Christianity, but also in direct opposition to LaVeyan Satanism. But this is not the case for most other forms of theistic Satanism. Indeed, the more common way that this works is that this involves a reinterpretation of the character of Satan. We saw some examples of this in the early 20th century with people like Ben Kadosh and Przybyszewski, where the Satan that is indeed worshipped isn't the personification of evil. Instead, in these cases, the devil is reinterpreted to have been misunderstood throughout history, to represent older pagan deities or as a spiritual being that brings light and knowledge, gnosis. Important for this is that other common name for Satan, Lucifer, meaning the morning star or light bringer. So in these forms of theistic Satanism, one worships Satan or Lucifer, but this is a Satan that is understood very differently from the common Christian narrative. And indeed, it's also quite common to see today that there is a distinction between Satanism and Luciferianism, basically almost as two distinct religions altogether. We do find some early examples of writers in the 19th and 20th century making a kind of distinction between Satan and Lucifer as essentially two different characters. Ben Kadosh seems to be making such a distinction in the Neo-Morgens Gry, and the Process Church of the Final Judgment in the 1960s and 70s has a theology that clearly distinguishes between Satan, Lucifer, Christ, and Jehovah as all being distinct spiritual principles. And in the writings of Leo Taxil, he does make a distinction in his presentation of Freemasonry that there is a Satanism and a Luciferianism within the movement that are different, where the former is definitely worse than the latter. But Taxil's entire writing project was later revealed to be a hoax. He had pretended to become Catholic and to write ridiculous things about Freemasonry in order to not only discredit the latter, but also to highlight the irrationality of the Catholics in their response to his writings. Still, the claims made by Taxil still sometimes show up as basis for critiques of Freemasonry and occultism today, despite their self-professed fraudulent nature.
There are some groups that would make a distinction between the two. And you could say that with Luciferianism in general, it's a bit more focused on perhaps the devil's connection to Enlightenment ideals, the devil as a bringer of gnosis and spiritual insight, as opposed to perhaps the embrace of the more demonic and chthonic sides of the figure in other contexts. Mm-hmm. Another category that you sometimes see would be devil worshippers, where some of the people in the black metal scene would perhaps use that as a self-designation, like I'm a devil worshipper. Mm-hmm. But it's also been used in a somewhat pejorative sense by LaVeyan Satanists to distinguish what they think is the one true Satanism from something that's perhaps a more primitive system of thought, devil worship.
In today's world, there are thus many different kinds of Satanism, and self-identifying as Satanists appear to be more popular than it has ever been. Many of the movements that we have been discussing so far are still to some degree alive today, but there also appeared significant new ones in the last decade or so. The most prominent example in recent years is, of course, the Satanic Temple, founded in 2013 by Malcolm Jari and Lucian Greaves, who has become the spokesperson and forward-facing leader of the movement. In some ways, the Satanic Temple is similar in approach to LaVey's Church of Satan, both holding to the atheistic interpretation of Satan as a, quote, cultural and religious symbol of rebellion, freedom, and independence. Unlike the Church of Satan, though, the Temple of Satan do not interpret the character as a symbol for earthly pleasure and satisfying the individual ego. Instead, the Satanic Temple is much more activist and political in nature. Theirs is a strongly anti-oppressive and feminist message where the imagery of Satanism is used in rebellion against patriarchy and oppression, instead championing ideals like social justice, rationalism and religious skepticism, the separation of church and state, and the right of individuals to have autonomy over their own bodies. In fact, the strong feminist nature of the movement is strengthened by the fact that it appears to be dominated by women in terms of adherents, something that has not been the case for earlier forms of Satanism. The Satanic Temple is thus also very critical of things like Christian nationalism and the forms of Christianity that represent the opposite of what they stand for. For example, the anti-LGBTQ+ stances of a lot of evangelical churches. Some have even considered the Satanic Temple to be a kind of public performance of satire, right? Because it exists so fundamentally just in opposition to things like Christian nationalism. The leaders of the movement have insisted that it is a serious movement, but there's no denying that that satire is sort of part of their whole deal, right? This has become very apparent through its various forms of public protest or campaigns that received quite a lot of media attention. For example, in 2014, the state of Oklahoma approved the erecting of a monument to the Ten Commandments outside the Oklahoma State Capitol. To many, including the members of the Satanic Temple, this was a violation of secularism and the separation of church and state. So instead, they launched a campaign to also erect a statue of Baphomet, a goat deity figure associated with Satan and Satanism generally. They argued that if the state was truly secular, then a statue of Baphomet is just as legitimate as one of the Ten Commandments. The Satanic Temple has also protested in favor of abortion rights and other stances often associated with the political left. Now, similar to the Church of Satan, they too have a kind of list of principles or fundamental tenets, which are the following. Number one should strive to act with compassion and empathy toward all creatures in accordance with reason. The struggle for justice is an ongoing and necessary pursuit that should prevail over laws and institutions. One's body is inviolable, subject to one's own will alone. The freedoms of others should be respected, including the freedom to offend. To willfully and unjustly encroach upon the freedoms of another is to forego one's own. Beliefs should conform to one's best scientific understanding of the world. One should take care never to distort scientific facts to fit one's beliefs. People are fallible. If one makes a mistake, one should do one's best to rectify it and resolve any harm that might have been caused. Every tenet is a guiding principle designed to inspire nobility in action and thought. The spirit of compassion, wisdom, and justice should always prevail over the written or spoken word. While it draws on earlier developments from the last 2 centuries, as we've explored in this episode, the Satanic Temple is very significant because it appears to be the most successful satanic movement in all of history, with some estimates showing that there are over 50,000 adherents. So it's safe to say that this is a story that will continue to develop. The word Satanism is thus one that is hard to define or pin down precisely. It's been used in many different ways, historically, both politically, religiously, and literary, right? If we understand it more broadly, it's a term that's been used historically primarily by the church to condemn heretics. It's a term that's been weaponized to apply to the other. But in the modern world, it can be used to denote something a bit more specific and more self-identified. These systems and movements that we can call Satanism can be more or less organized from the occult and esoteric writings of Blavatsky and Przybyszewski to the highly organized Church of Satan. It can be atheistic, where Satan represents rebellion, nonconformity, and freedom, or it can be theistic, where an actual spiritual being called Satan or Lucifer is worshipped, sometimes as a deeply reinterpreted esoteric or divine figure. Satan has been and remains a deeply provocative character, and has thus played a major role in social and political movements. And interestingly, we can see that he can become a symbolic figurehead for widely different, sometimes polar opposing ideologies. From the far-right tendencies of the Order of Nine Angels or some aspects of the black metal communities of the 90s, to much more progressive and left-leaning groups like the Church of Satan, or especially the Satanic Temple in the modern world. It is safe to say thus that this is, as always, a very complicated topic, but still one that is incredibly relevant for understanding modern discussions about religion, belief, and identity today. This has been another episode in the wider Spooky Tube, perhaps collaboration that we're doing here in the spooky season. Me, Justin Sledge, Dr. Justin Sledge from Esoterica, and Dr. Angela Puka from Angela's Symposium. So if you haven't already, then first of all, go subscribe to them, but also go check out all the spooky content that they've been posting this month, along with myself. This, as always, is such a fun season, and I just love bringing you these episodes about these more dark topics. It really it fits so well into the mood, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I enjoy making them. Thank you so much for watching this video and this year's Shocktober videos. You can find me and my work here and on my other channel, Feel the Poem, which is primarily dedicated to music. You can find me also on my socials if you're interested in following me. By the time I release this episode, it's probably going to be Halloween, either maybe today or at least very soon. So I hope whatever tradition it is that you follow, whether it's you're going to be celebrating Halloween and just eating candy and watching horror movies, I hope you have a wonderful Halloween. If you celebrate Samhain, I hope that is very beautiful and meaningful for you. Or if it's a regular day just like any other, I hope you have a wonderful day. And with that, I wish you a happy Halloween, and I will see you next time.